The snow had fallen through the night. It covered the pine branches in white silence. It buried foxholes. It muffled footsteps. It turned the forest into something almost peaceful. At the edge of a frozen clearing, a column of American trucks halted. Engines cut. Doors opened. Young men stepped down into knee-deep snow, fresh replacements. Many had never heard live artillery before. Far beyond the tree line, German guns rolled like distant thunder. Across the line, officers of the Wehrmacht studied captured documents and prisoner reports. New American units. Recently arrived. Inexperienced. The words carried a certain amusement. For months, German veterans had faced American formations and found them aggressive but predictable. Soft at first contact. Quick to withdraw. Dependent on artillery. Now, as winter tightened its grip, Berlin gambled that these green divisions would shatter under pressure. But in the Ardennes, beneath the snow and smoke, something was changing. When war erupted in Europe in September 1939, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than Portugal's. It possessed fewer than 200,000 active-duty soldiers. Much of its equipment dated back to the First World War. Tanks were scarce. Modern artillery was limited. Large-scale maneuver doctrine was theoretical. Across the Atlantic, the German Wehrmacht was already the most battle-hardened force on earth. Poland fell in weeks. France collapsed in 6. By the summer of 1941, German divisions had driven deep into the Soviet Union, capturing millions of prisoners. Blitzkrieg had become legend. German officers viewed warfare as an art refined through movement, coordination, and ruthlessness. In Berlin's military circles, America was not feared. The United States was seen as industrial, wealthy, and politically divided, a commercial power, not a martial one. Its soldiers were assumed to be comfortable, undisciplined, reliant on machinery rather than endurance. German war diaries frequently described Americans as materialschlacht warriors, fighters who depended on massed equipment rather than tactical finesse. Even after Pearl Harbor in December 1941 forced the United States fully into the war, skepticism remained. Germany declared war on America on December 11, 1941, confident that the Atlantic would delay any meaningful U.S. military presence in Europe for years. But American mobilization began immediately. Selective service had already begun in 1940. After Pearl Harbor, the scale transformed. Training camps rose across the United States, in Georgia, Texas, California, the Midwest. Civilians became soldiers in months. Farmers, factory workers, students, mechanics. Entire divisions were activated, trained, equipped, and scheduled for deployment. Yet training could not replicate combat. The first large American ground engagement against German forces came in North Africa in late 1942. Operation Torch placed inexperienced American troops against seasoned Afrika Korps veterans commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. In February 1943, at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, the weaknesses were exposed. German armored units punched through American lines. Coordination faltered. Command structures hesitated. Units withdrew in confusion. Casualties mounted. Equipment was abandoned. The defeat was not catastrophic in strategic terms, but psychologically it reinforced German assumptions. American soldiers were brave, many observers noted. But bravery without experience could not halt panzer divisions. German after-action reports described American troops as poorly led, tactically naive, overly dependent on artillery support, and quick to break under concentrated assault. Prisoners taken at Kasserine were often young, uncertain, visibly shaken. The laughter was not theatrical. It was professional. German officers had faced the British for years. They had studied Soviet resistance. Against those opponents, they expected resilience forged by prolonged struggle. The Americans, by contrast, were newcomers. But beneath the surface of early setbacks, adjustments were already underway. General Dwight D. Eisenhower reorganized command structures in North Africa. Leadership changes were swift. Officers deemed ineffective were replaced. Training intensified even while the campaign continued. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery improved rapidly. More importantly, the American replacement and mobilization system did not pause. By mid-1943, millions of American men were in uniform. Entire divisions rotated through stateside training cycles designed to standardize doctrine. Logistical pipelines ensured steady flows of rifles, machine guns, Sherman tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. Ship convoys crossed the Atlantic continuously despite U-boat threats. The Wehrmacht measured opponents largely by battlefield encounters. What they observed in Tunisia suggested a force still learning. What they did not fully calculate was how quickly that learning curve would accelerate. Because in war, experience can be taught only through survival, and the United States possessed something Germany did not: time, manpower, and an industrial base capable of sustaining both. And as the war shifted from North Africa to the mountains of Italy, the first signs appeared that these green formations were no longer the same army that had faltered at Kasserine. After Tunisia, the American army did not retreat into reflection. It moved forward. In July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily under Operation Husky. For many American divisions, it was their second test under fire. The terrain was harsh: steep ridges, stone villages, narrow roads overlooked by German defensive positions. This was no open desert. It demanded coordination, patience, and adaptation. German units on the island were experienced and disciplined. Yet they encountered something different than at Kasserine. American artillery fire was precise and relentless. Naval gunfire supported advances inland. Logistics flowed steadily despite heat and dust. When German forces withdrew toward Messina, they did so in good order, but they did not dismiss the American effort. Reports noted improvement in coordination and aggressive infantry action. Then came Italy. In September 1943, Allied forces landed at Salerno. The German response was immediate and violent. Counterattacks nearly pushed the beachhead back into the sea. Casualties mounted quickly. Once again, fresh American troops faced seasoned German formations, Panzergrenadiers, Fallschirmjäger, units hardened on the Eastern Front. But this time, they held. American divisions dug in. Artillery concentrations broke armored thrusts. Reinforcements arrived methodically. The line stabilized. What had nearly become another early war collapse instead became a grinding stalemate, and then a steady advance northward through the Italian peninsula. The Italian campaign was not dramatic in speed. It was brutal in endurance. Mountain warfare demanded stamina. German defensive lines, the Gustav Line, the Winter Line, later the Gothic Line, were engineered carefully. Every ridge was contested. Every river crossing required planning. Here, American divisions accumulated something more valuable than equipment: experience. Fresh replacements flowed into existing units. The U.S. Army operated a replacement depot system, often called Repel-Depel, by soldiers, that funneled individual soldiers to frontline units as casualties occurred. It was imperfect and often emotionally harsh, inserting newcomers into veteran squads. But it ensured that divisions maintained strength over time. Germany could not do the same at scale. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was bleeding heavily on the Eastern Front. Entire divisions were shattered against the Red Army. Replacements were younger, older, less trained. Equipment production struggled under Allied bombing. Fuel shortages became chronic. In contrast, the United States was increasing output. By the end of 1943, American factories were producing tens of thousands of aircraft annually, thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of trucks. Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic in constant waves. German intelligence followed these developments, but interpretation lagged behind reality. American soldiers were still described in many German assessments as tactically rigid and overly dependent on firepower. The assumption persisted, without overwhelming artillery and air support, they would falter. That belief hardened as planning began for the defense of Western Europe. In June 1944, the Allies would attempt something unprecedented. A cross-channel invasion of fortified France. German commanders understood the scale. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel inspected coastal defenses personally. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, artillery nests, the Atlantic Wall was strengthened. Yet confidence remained. The Wehrmacht expected heavy casualties among the first waves. They anticipated that inexperienced American divisions, thrown into chaos on open beaches, would break under concentrated fire. The belief was rooted in earlier encounters, in Tunisia, in early Sicily, where green units had struggled. What German planners did not fully grasp was that the American army landing in Normandy would not be the same force that had stumbled at Kasserine. It would be supported by unparalleled naval gunfire. Dominated by Allied air superiority. Supplied by an industrial machine operating at full momentum. And composed of divisions that had trained together for years. The laughter of 1943 was fading. But it had not yet disappeared. Because in the minds of many German officers, one final assumption remained, that fresh American replacements, inserted into the chaos of Europe's most fortified coastline, would prove that industrial power could not replace battlefield instinct. That assumption would soon be tested on the shores of Normandy, where inexperienced faces would step once more into gunfire, and this time, the outcome would not follow the old script. By 1944, the American army had grown into a force of more than 8 million men. But numbers on paper did not explain the quiet transformation taking place inside infantry companies across Europe. The replacement soldier arrived alone. He did not land with his training platoon. He did not enter combat beside childhood friends. He was processed through depots in England or France, assigned to a unit that had already fought, and sent forward in trucks under blackout conditions. Often, his first night at the front was his introduction to war. Veteran squads received him with guarded eyes. Casualties had been constant since Normandy. Trust was not immediate. A newcomer had to prove he would not panic under shellfire, that he would stay in the line when German artillery began its slow, methodical searching. The German army understood cohesion. Its early war units had trained together for years. In contrast, American replacements were fed into existing formations individually. On paper, this system appeared fragile. German observers assumed morale would collapse if inexperienced men were forced directly into combat. But something else occurred. The American system created continuity. Divisions did not dissolve after heavy losses. They absorbed shock and remained operational. Veterans transmitted lessons quickly. Survival knowledge passed from foxhole to foxhole. Within days, sometimes hours, a replacement was no longer entirely green. By late 1944, many of these fresh faces had endured Normandy hedgerows, French villages under sniper fire, endless road marches through Belgium. They were no longer theoretical soldiers. They were learning faster than German intelligence expected. And that shift at the human level would influence how entire formations fought when the line was tested again. The United States Army approached war as an integrated system. Infantry divisions were not isolated entities. They were supported by attached tank battalions, tank destroyer units, engineer companies, signal corps, medical services, and above all, artillery. American doctrine emphasized coordinated firepower. When German units encountered U.S. formations in Normandy, they noted the speed at which artillery responded. Forward observers carried radios. Requests for fire could be processed within minutes. Massed batteries could converge on a single grid coordinate with devastating precision. German officers sometimes interpreted this as a weakness, a dependence on material superiority. Yet it was a deliberate design. Where German divisions relied heavily on maneuver and local initiative, the American approach prioritized sustained pressure. If infantry stalled, artillery compensated. If armor encountered resistance, air support was requested. The system reduced catastrophic collapse even when individual elements faltered. Fresh divisions arriving in France during mid-1944 entered a battlefield already shaped by Allied dominance in logistics and air power. Supplies moved continuously from the beaches through expanding depots. Replacement equipment reached units with efficiency Germany could no longer match. Moreover, American divisions were rotated strategically. Units exhausted by prolonged combat were occasionally pulled back for rest and refit. While not always generous, these pauses allowed cohesion to stabilize. German formations, stretched thin across multiple fronts, rarely enjoyed similar relief. Thus, when German commanders evaluated fresh American divisions, they often judged them by age or battlefield inexperience. They did not always account for the infrastructure surrounding them, the artillery network, the truck convoys, the fuel reserves, the replacement streams. And in modern war, infrastructure could decide outcomes before rifles ever fired. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, German intelligence assessments of American ground forces remained mixed. Reports acknowledged American industrial capacity and air superiority. They recognized the scale of mobilization. But tactical evaluations frequently described U.S. infantry as cautious, slow to exploit breakthroughs, and overly reliant on heavy firepower. There was truth in some observations. American commanders often avoided high-risk frontal assaults if artillery or airstrikes could achieve the objective with fewer casualties. German doctrine, forged in earlier campaigns, prized aggressive maneuver and rapid exploitation. Yet intelligence interpretation can be shaped by expectation. The early defeats in North Africa lingered in memory. The assumption formed that American formations required time under fire before becoming effective. Therefore, newly deployed divisions were presumed vulnerable during initial engagements. By late 1944, this assumption would influence operational planning. When the German High Command prepared its winter offensive in the Ardennes, planners believed that thinly held sectors manned by relatively inexperienced American units could be penetrated quickly. Speed would create confusion. Confusion would create collapse. The laughter of earlier campaigns had evolved into strategic calculation. But calculation based on outdated impressions can become dangerous. Because the American Army of December 1944 was no longer the Army of February 1943. And the forests of Belgium would reveal just how deeply that misjudgment ran. At the highest levels, the transformation of the American Army was not accidental. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood coalition warfare. His strength was not dramatic battlefield maneuver, but coordination, aligning British, American, and later French forces into a unified structure. Beneath him, commanders like Omar Bradley and George S. Patton shaped operational identity in different ways. Bradley favored methodical advance. He believed in preparation, in careful buildup of supply lines, in reducing unnecessary losses. Patton emphasized speed and aggression, pushing armored columns forward with relentless momentum once a breach appeared. German commanders observed both styles. They noted Bradley's caution during the Normandy hedgerow fighting. They feared Patton's rapid exploitation after Operation Cobra in July 1944, when American forces broke out of the bocage and surged across France. Entire German formations were encircled in the Falaise pocket. Thousands were killed or captured. Fresh American divisions participated in that advance. These were not elite pre-war professionals. Many had trained only months before deployment. Yet under structured leadership and clear operational doctrine, they moved with confidence. Air superiority isolated German units. Fuel shortages crippled withdrawals. American armored columns advanced at speeds that surprised even their own planners. Leadership mattered. German officers had once believed that American command structures were inexperienced and politically cautious. By late 1944, that assumption no longer aligned with battlefield reality. American generals demonstrated increasing operational cohesion, coordinating multi-division offensives across wide fronts. The system was not flawless. There were missteps, delays, friction between personalities. But it functioned with growing efficiency. And as command matured, so did the soldiers beneath it. Behind every American infantryman stood an industrial engine unmatched in modern history. By 1944, U.S. factories had produced over 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, nearly 300,000 aircraft, and millions of rifles and machine guns. Liberty ships delivered equipment across the Atlantic at a pace Germany could not interdict. Fuel flowed in quantities the Wehrmacht could scarcely imagine. German divisions often fought under strict fuel rationing. Armored movements were calculated carefully. Air support diminished as aviation gasoline became scarce. Replacement vehicles arrived slowly, if at all. In contrast, American divisions arriving in France were fully motorized. Trucks enabled rapid redeployment. Artillery ammunition was plentiful. Damaged equipment could be replaced. German soldiers sometimes described American forces as fighting a material battle. It was not an insult. It was recognition. The weight of production meant that even when fresh divisions lacked combat experience, they were rarely isolated. They fought with artillery barrages measured in thousands of shells per day. They operated under protective air cover. They advanced with logistical confidence. Industrial depth reduced the margin of catastrophic failure. And as 1944 progressed, Germany's capacity to replace losses diminished sharply, while American manpower streams continued steadily forward. The balance of endurance was shifting. War is not decided by steel alone. By the autumn of 1944, American units had marched from Normandy's beaches through Paris, across Belgium, toward Germany's western frontier. Casualties were heavy. Replacement soldiers continued to arrive. Young faces stepping into veteran formations. German intelligence still tracked these arrivals. Some reports labeled sectors held by newer American divisions as opportunities for breakthrough. There remained belief that morale would fracture under sudden pressure. Yet months of sustained combat had altered the psychology of the American army. Soldiers who had once been civilians were now accustomed to artillery shockwaves and winter mud. They had learned to distrust quiet nights. They understood how to dig defensive positions quickly, how to coordinate with artillery observers, how to hold a road junction until reinforcements arrived. Caution had transformed into discipline. This psychological evolution was less visible than tank production figures or divisional rosters. It did not appear in shipment manifests. But it accumulated in foxholes, in frozen forests, in towns reduced to rubble. The German High Command believed a sharp winter offensive could exploit American inexperience in selected sectors. Speed would create panic. Panic would unravel the front. What they did not fully recognize was that even fresh American divisions in late 1944 were entering a battlefield shaped by veterans, structured logistics, and a system designed to absorb shock. And when that winter offensive began in the Ardennes, the assumption of easy collapse would meet a reality forged over 2 relentless years of adaptation. By the summer of 1944, the Atlantic Wall had been breached. On June 6, Allied forces landed along the Normandy coastline. American divisions at Utah and Omaha beaches endured heavy resistance, particularly at Omaha, where German defensive fire inflicted severe casualties in the opening hours. Yet by nightfall, beachheads were secure. German commanders had expected chaos to overwhelm inexperienced troops. Instead, the landings held. Through June and early July, the fighting in Normandy slowed into a brutal contest of hedgerows. The Bocage country favored defense. German units, including elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr, fought from concealed positions, forcing costly, yard-by-yard advances. American divisions, many new to sustained European combat, adapted under pressure. Infantry-tank coordination improved. Engineers modified Sherman tanks with hedgerow-cutting devices. Artillery fire became increasingly precise. Then, on July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra began. After a concentrated aerial bombardment near St. Lo, American forces punched through weakened German lines. The breakthrough was not immediate perfection, bombing errors caused American casualties, but the German defensive structure fractured. General Patton's Third Army exploited the opening. Fresh American divisions surged west and south, then pivoted east in a sweeping movement that threatened to encircle German forces retreating from Normandy. Speed became the defining factor. Columns advanced across open countryside, supported by overwhelming air superiority. By mid-August, the Falaise pocket formed. German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trapped between converging Allied forces. Attempts to escape under constant air attack and artillery fire resulted in catastrophic losses. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment was abandoned in staggering quantities. For many German officers, this was the moment the earlier assumptions began to fracture. These were not brittle formations collapsing at first contact. These were divisions advancing relentlessly across France, maintaining cohesion despite rapid movement. Replacement soldiers filled gaps without halting momentum. Supply columns kept pace. Yet even as Allied forces liberated Paris on August 25 and pressed toward Belgium, German leadership sought one final opportunity. They believed that the rapid American advance had stretched supply lines thin. Fuel shortages slowed armored spearheads in September. Operation Market Garden failed to secure a decisive Rhine crossing. In Berlin, a calculation formed. If the Western Front could be split, if American lines, particularly those held by newer divisions in quieter sectors, could be broken, the Allies might be forced into negotiation or at least delayed long enough for Germany to stabilize. The Ardennes, heavily forested and thinly held, appeared suitable. Intelligence suggested that certain American divisions in that sector were resting, refitting, or inexperienced. Weather conditions in winter would limit Allied air power. Surprise would compensate for material inferiority. On December 16, 1944, before dawn, over 200,000 German troops launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes. Artillery opened across an 80-mile front. Infantry advanced through snow-covered forests. Armored columns sought to penetrate deep and seize key road junctions. The plan depended on one assumption, that American forces, especially fresh divisions holding quieter sectors, would fracture under concentrated assault. In the first hours, confusion spread. Telephone lines were cut. Forward units were overrun. Prisoners were taken. Road networks clogged with retreating vehicles. German commanders sensed opportunity. But as the offensive pushed westward, the response it encountered was not the collapse predicted in planning rooms. Instead, scattered American units, many containing newly arrived replacements, began to organize resistance in frozen woods and small Belgian villages. And in those early days of the Battle of the Bulge, the outcome would hinge on whether those green soldiers truly were as fragile as once believed. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, the German offensive began with more than 1,600 artillery pieces firing simultaneously across the Ardennes front. Snow covered the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. In the opening hours, surprise was nearly complete. American units along the sector included elements of the 106th Infantry Division, recently arrived in Europe, and the 28th Infantry Division, still recovering from heavy losses in the Hurtgen forest. Portions of the 99th Infantry Division, also relatively new to sustained combat, held critical ridgelines near Elsenborn. German planners believed these formations would disintegrate quickly. The offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, aimed to drive west across the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split British and American forces. Speed was essential. Shock was decisive. In the Schnee-Eifel sector, the 106th Infantry Division was struck hard. Two of its regiments were eventually encircled and forced to surrender after days of resistance, over 6,000 men captured. For German commanders, this appeared to validate expectations. But elsewhere, the pattern shifted. North of the main German thrust, the 99th Infantry Division, supported by the 2nd Infantry Division, held firm at Elsenborn Ridge. German armored units attacked repeatedly, seeking breakthrough. Artillery duels raged in freezing conditions. American forward observers called down concentrated barrages with precision despite snow and disrupted communications. The ridge did not fall. This defense proved critical. By preventing a northern collapse, American forces blocked key road networks necessary for rapid German exploitation. Further south, scattered American units formed improvised defensive lines in villages such as Saint-Vith and Bastogne. At Saint-Vith, elements of the 7th Armored Division, rushed into position, delayed German advances for days. Time, the one resource Germany could not spare, slipped away in small increments of resistance. Then came Bastogne. The town was a vital road junction. Without it, German armored columns could not sustain their westward drive. American High Command ordered the 101st Airborne Division, along with combat command elements of the 10th Armored Division and various support units, to hold the town. Many of the soldiers arriving in Bastogne were replacements. Some had been in Europe only weeks. They entered foxholes in sub-zero temperatures with limited winter clothing and shrinking supplies. By December 21, Bastogne was surrounded. German forces demanded surrender. The reply from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, "Nuts," became symbolic, but the defense itself was not symbolic. It was sustained by artillery discipline, coordinated perimeter defense, and continuous resistance despite shortages of ammunition and medical supplies. Weather began to shift. On December 23, skies cleared. Allied aircraft returned, dropping supplies to surrounded units and attacking German supply columns. Fuel shortages worsened for the advancing panzers. Roads became clogged with destroyed vehicles. Fresh American divisions continued arriving at the edges of the Bulge. The 82nd Airborne. The 3rd Army under Patton pivoting north in a rapid maneuver that German intelligence had not anticipated at such speed. On December 26, elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, relieving the encircled defenders. The German offensive did not collapse instantly. Fighting continued into January 1945. But the momentum had shifted. The assumption that American lines, especially those held by newer or resting divisions, would crumble under concentrated attack proved false in critical sectors. Resistance at Elsenborn Ridge, Saint-Vith, and Bastogne disrupted timetables. Delays multiplied. Fuel ran short. Air power returned. By January 25, 1945, the Bulge had been erased. German losses were severe, an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 casualties, including irreplaceable armored vehicles and experienced personnel. For the Wehrmacht, the Ardennes offensive marked the last major attempt to reverse the war in the West. For American forces, it marked something else. The laughter that had once accompanied early encounters with green American troops had faded entirely. Even fresh divisions had absorbed shock, reorganized under pressure, and held ground in the worst winter conditions of the European war. Germany had gambled on inexperience. Instead, it encountered resilience reinforced by system, leadership, and accumulated adaptation. And with the failure of the Ardennes offensive, the path toward Germany's western frontier lay exposed, setting the stage for the final collapse of the Third Reich's defenses. When the Ardennes offensive ended in late January 1945, the Western Front did not return to its previous state. It shifted irreversibly. German armored reserves had been committed in desperation. Many of the Reich's remaining experienced panzer crews were lost in the frozen forests of Belgium. Fuel stocks, already critically low, had been consumed in a gamble that failed. Replacement tanks could not match losses. Replacement soldiers were younger, less trained, and fewer in number. The Wehrmacht had expended strength it could not regenerate. On the American side, casualties during the Battle of the Bulge were heavy, over 80,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Entire units had been battered. But the difference lay in depth. Replacement streams continued to arrive from the United States. Equipment flowed across the Atlantic without interruption. Divisions refitted and returned to the line within weeks. More importantly, the psychological equation had changed. German field reports after the Ardennes reflected a growing acknowledgement: American troops had demonstrated increasing tactical discipline and defensive tenacity. Surprise alone was no longer sufficient to produce collapse. Even newly positioned divisions had resisted long enough to disrupt operational timelines. In February 1945, Allied forces resumed the offensive along the entire Western Front. To the north, British and Canadian forces advanced into the Rhineland. American 1st and 9th Armies pushed through the Roer River region after the Germans destroyed dams in an attempt to flood the terrain. To the south, Patton's 3rd Army continued its drive through Luxembourg toward the Saar. German resistance remained fierce in places. Towns were defended street by street. Artillery fire was still accurate. But the initiative had shifted permanently. American divisions now operated with accumulated experience across multiple campaigns. North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Bulge. Replacement soldiers entering units in early 1945 were integrated into formations whose corps had endured nearly 2 years of continuous combat. The system absorbed losses and maintained momentum. In March 1945, an unexpected opportunity emerged at Remagen. On March 7, elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine River intact. German demolition charges failed to destroy it completely. American troops crossed quickly, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank. For the first time, Allied forces stood firmly beyond the Rhine, Germany's last major natural defensive barrier in the west. The crossing at Remagen was not part of a grand pre-planned breakthrough. It was a moment seized under pressure. Fresh units and veterans alike crossed the damaged span under artillery fire. Engineers worked continuously to reinforce it while Luftwaffe attacks attempted to destroy the crossing. The bridge eventually collapsed on March 17, killing several engineers. But by then, thousands of American troops and vehicles had already crossed. The psychological barrier was broken. German commanders now faced Allied armies advancing on multiple axes inside the Reich itself. Industrial cities were bombed relentlessly. Soviet forces pressed from the east. The Western Allies advanced from the west and south. The Wehrmacht could still fight, and often did so with determination, but it could no longer restore equilibrium. Fresh American divisions continued to take positions at the front, no longer perceived as fragile newcomers but as components of an overwhelming force that combined manpower, logistics, and hardened experience. The laughter of 1943 had given way to recognition in 1945. And as Allied armies fanned out across Western Germany, encircling entire German formations in the Ruhr pocket, the final consequences of that earlier misjudgment became impossible to ignore. After the Rhine crossings in March 1945, the Western Front ceased to resemble a continuous defensive line. It fragmented. American and British forces expanded their bridgeheads rapidly. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group drove deep into central Germany. To the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's forces crossed near Wesel under Operation Plunder. The scale of Allied coordination, airborne drops, artillery preparation, armored exploitation, reflected a war machine operating at full capacity. German resistance persisted, but it lacked cohesion. Fuel shortages immobilized armored units. Communications were disrupted by constant air attacks. Replacement soldiers, often teenagers or older reservists, filled depleted ranks. The experienced corps that had once formed the backbone of German divisions had been eroded on the Eastern Front and in the Ardennes. In April 1945, American forces executed one of the largest encirclements of the war in the Ruhr. The Ruhr pocket trapped approximately 300,000 German troops, Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model. Surrounded by converging Allied armies, cut off from supply and reinforcement, the pocket gradually collapsed. On April 18, organized resistance within the Ruhr ended. Model committed suicide shortly afterward. This was not a sudden battlefield panic. It was systemic exhaustion. Meanwhile, American divisions continued advancing eastward with increasing speed. Cities such as Cologne, Frankfurt, Kassel, and Leipzig fell in succession. Some were heavily defended. Others surrendered quickly as civilian authorities recognized the inevitability of defeat. Fresh American replacements were still entering units during these final weeks. Casualties did not disappear. Urban combat remained dangerous. Snipers operated from ruined buildings. Artillery exchanges flared unexpectedly. But the operational tempo no longer favored Germany. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River near Torgau. The Third Reich was physically divided. Berlin was encircled by the Red Army. Western Allied forces halted along agreed demarcation lines, but their advance had already rendered organized German resistance in the West unsustainable. German reports from these final weeks increasingly acknowledged the scale of American strength. Not merely in numbers. In endurance. The U.S. Army had demonstrated the capacity to absorb heavy losses, integrate replacements, refit divisions, and resume offensive operations without strategic pause. What German officers once dismissed as over-reliance on material had proven to be a decisive structural advantage. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Reims. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8. The transformation was complete. An army once considered inexperienced and fragile had crossed France, endured winter counteroffensives, breached the Rhine, and occupied the heart of Germany within less than a year. The early laughter had been rooted in genuine observation. The U.S. Army of 1942 was inexperienced. But by 1945, those fresh divisions, replenished, reinforced, and hardened through continuous combat, stood as part of the force that dismantled the Wehrmacht in the West. And in that transformation lay a larger lesson about industrial war, adaptation, and the danger of underestimating an opponent still learning how to fight. War often measures strength in blood, steel, and endurance. Yet it is equally a measure of adaptation. The story of the American replacements in World War II illustrates this truth. Soldiers who arrived at the front with minimal experience, thrown into frozen forests, hedgerows, and urban ruins, became a critical component of victory. What seemed fragile at first, in North Africa, in early Sicily, at Kasserine, evolved into resilience forged through repeated exposure, structured leadership, and the sustaining power of logistics and industrial might. Germany's early assumptions, rooted in observation but outdated by rapid American adaptation, proved costly. Laughter at perceived weakness turned into incredulity when fresh divisions held ground, coordinated counterattacks, and absorbed shock with unexpected discipline. The U.S. Army's combination of manpower, preparation, and systematic replenishment created a force capable of turning attrition into momentum. This transformation carried lessons beyond the battlefield. It showed that in modern war, underestimation can be fatal, and that strength is not only measured by initial skill, but by the capacity to learn, integrate, and endure. The American replacements, once doubted, once dismissed, became symbols of a nation mobilized, adaptive, and relentless. In the end, the Ardennes, Normandy, and the march into Germany were not merely military campaigns. They were proof that experience, industry, and human resolve together can turn perceived weakness into decisive power.